Hi everyone, I'm Joni Green. I'm a managing consultant for F-Secure's incident response team. And my talk today is about how incident response has been affected by the pandemic. I'll provide some insight into some of the challenges my team have encountered as a result of the pandemic. And most importantly, I will discuss what the lessons we've learned are and how we can better prepare for the unknown when it comes to incident response. So if we think about how the pandemic affected cybersecurity in general and incident response, we know that the pandemic definitely turned organizations inside out. And we had to weaken our own perimeter defenses to enable operations, and the way in which we work drastically changed for everybody. And there was a lot of sort of adapting that we had to do. Now, remote working is certainly not a new concept, but secure infrastructure really requires advanced planning. And this is not a luxury that we had when the rug was ripped up out from under us. And organizations who didn't have live monitoring and rapid threat detection already in place suffered the most. Now, how did companies respond? Well, we saw a lot of rapid solutions having to be deployed out of necessity rather than as a result of long-term security strategies. And we saw the increase of the use of cloud services. So organizations that had cloud transition projects in the pipeline had to accelerate these to enable operations. We saw a marked increase in the reliance on personal devices. So, for example, bring your own device policies for organizations that used Citrix or other virtual desktop environments. And we saw bandwidth issues causing networks to topple, and in turn causing an increase in the use of software as a service offerings. And this was essentially to relieve the pressure of staff members now trying to connect into already strained networks. Over the past 2 years, we've seen some interesting critical vulnerabilities that have popped up. And because of all the limitations and the pressures we've had on our IT teams, a lot of critical patching delays were observed because they were having to focus on continuing operations and not necessarily on putting security first. As for what changed, so if we considered the numbers of intrusion activity over time, and we saw that intrusion activity didn't actually increase because of the pandemic. But what did increase were opportunities to use things like COVID-19 as collateral for phishing campaigns and fear-mongering. And threat actors also started to target organizations with medically sensitive data and also those working in vaccine research. What we did see was an overwhelming increase in ransomware attacks. So along with the pandemic came what we're referring to as the year of ransomware. And to give you some perspective, in the first 6 months of 2021 alone, global ransomware attacks increased by 151% as compared to the previous year. And the industries that were hit the hardest was healthcare, schools, government facilities. So let's look at the ransomware attacks over the past 5 years. If we look at this data, we can see that while we were learning new skills like baking banana bread or learning how to knit and crochet, the ransomware gangs were instead spending time perfecting the ransomware as a service model. And this is a model that turns out to be very profitable indeed. And there's a few reasons for that. Basically, the first is likely because of the increase in the opportunities that I mentioned earlier for attackers to exploit people's fears. And another reason is the evolution of how ransomware gangs operate and the models that they use. So in 2017, we saw an increase in attacks basically because of the WannaCry and the Petya not Petya incidents, with a market sort of less incidents in 2018, 2019, with a very obvious increase in 2020 and 2021. So let's dive into why that might be. So if we consider how ransomware models have evolved over time, if we consider that ransomware certainly existed in small pockets before 2013, but it didn't take off in scale until the introduction of CryptoLocker in 2013. So this kicked off a surge in opportunistic single device type of attacks that presented an easy way of monetizing cybercrime. And then more recently, the the recent phase in ransomware evolution, we can trace it back to the WannaCry and the NotPetya incident in 2016 and 2017. And this is the first time we saw the fusing of large-scale compromise techniques and encryption payloads. So this is when the threat actors basically started demanding ransomware payments in exchange for decryption keys. And this fusion is what inspired this new generation of ransomware attacks, and we'll call them human-operated ransomware attacks, that started to pop up around June in 2019. At this point, the business model expanded into enterprise-scale operations, blending the targeted attack techniques with the extortion business models. So we started to see things like double extortion, where they're not only encrypt your data, but they'd first actually steal it, exfiltrate it, and then later threaten to leak it publicly if the organizations didn't pay up. And I'd say that the pandemic just created the right set of circumstances for this model to really take off. If we look at the industries that were affected by ransomware in 2020, we can see top 5 being manufacturing, government, education, services, healthcare. And in this context, I'm talking about services as managed IT services. And this really highlights the risk of supply chain attacks, which is some of the major incidents were caused by supply chain attacks in the last 2 years. And if we look at 2021, we can see government, education services, healthcare, technology being the top 5, with manufacturing dropping down slightly. I'm assuming that is because of the drop or the need for lockdowns and perhaps that manufacturing firms had to close operations for quite some time. Unfortunately, nothing is off limits for these gangs. Pictured here is a recent FBI advisory indicating that ransomware actors have been targeting healthcare and first responder networks despite the current healthcare crisis that we're in. And this was in May 2021, and it indicates that the Conti ransomware gangs are still impacting healthcare and first responder networks. So I will now provide some insight into the perspective from an incident response team during the pandemic, specifically my team that I work with every day, and how the pandemic affected IR operations. What is the goal of IR? So we have to invariably do 3 things. We have to answer, how did the incident actually happen? What happened? What did the attackers do? When did it happen? And importantly, if it's happening right now, our primary goal becomes, how can we contain this with the least impact in the shortest amount of time? And there are a couple of approaches that we can use in incident response when we are trying to do this. So first approach being the live threat approach. So this is when the attacker is still there, they haven't achieved their objective yet. Our goal becomes, we need to stop them and eradicate them as swiftly as possible. And what do we need to be able to do this? Well, we need visibility of the estate in some way to swiftly respond to the threat. The second approach is the post-mortem approach. And this is when the attacker has already achieved their objectives and the damage is done. The incident has been detected long after it's actually happened. And unfortunately, this is the approach we're having to take as incident response teams more and more often, which is not something that we like, or not a situation that we like to find ourselves in. And what is needed for this approach is essentially a way to access the data in order to tell the story of what happened. We need to answer the key questions. What did the attacker do? What was the impact? Did they actually take the data? And the key ingredient here is still visibility, even if that visibility is historical. So we need to make sure that evidence hasn't been destroyed. For example, has snapshots been retained? Does aggregated log data exist? And can we answer those really important questions? But the key point here is that without early detection, incident response happens when it's too late to minimize the impact, which is something that you can change with a bit of foresight and planning. Some important factors to summarize here is that visibility enables early detection. This now enables us to answer the questions, where has the attacker been? Where are they now? And we need some way to respond at scale. So we need to be able to figure out a way to collect data from a large-scale environment in a short amount of time. And we need to be able to stop the attacker from reaching their objective using the mechanism for responding at scale. So if we think of the state of incident response pre-pandemic, so what were things like then? So before the pandemic, most incident response work was actually done remotely anyway. And EDR technology enables rapid response and faster recovery, which means less money. And this is the reason why things were mostly remote, at least for most incident response firms. Traditional incident response can be inefficient and costly. Now, don't get me wrong, there is certainly still a place for traditional incident response where we would send investigators on site and we would sort of do old school data collection. And sometimes we still have to do this under certain circumstances. But like I said, these can be expensive and sometimes not as effective as we'd like them to be. And this is slowly becoming a thing of the past for most incident response firms. What about from the organization's perspective? So what are the biggest challenges that we saw the pandemic bringing to organizations? So firstly, the overwhelming feedback we got from our clients, even the most mature ones who spent a lot of time preparing their incident response plans and processes, is that they struggled with communication in major incidents. And we can imagine what this might be like for them. So if you're the incident manager for a large organization and you're now having to deal with the priority one incident and your team is no longer in the same room as you. So we were always used to being able to go into one room together. We can figure things out. We can whiteboard the timeline, what's going down with the incidents, and we can speak to each other. Now, suddenly, all of the teams were remote, and we had to rely on things like Teams or Slack or whichever communication method. And all of the information coming at you at once as an incident manager becomes overwhelming, and it becomes really difficult to actually keep track of what is happening and who's doing what. Another thing that another challenge that we noted was certainly deploying EDR was not easy even before the pandemic. If you're trying to do it in the midst of an incident, it's not a good idea. But if you couldn't see your environment and detect the threats before the pandemic, trying to find solutions to do so when you couldn't physically access your own network became quite a challenge for a lot of organizations. Another issue was getting access to the right data. So this became a lot harder for things like software as a service. So I mentioned earlier the increase in software as a service. And because of the haste that we had to deploy these solutions, there wasn't a lot of thought that went into where the logs might be for the software as a service, or what the process is involved in getting those. And sometimes the software as a service providers only have short amounts of data retention for logs. So these are things that were not well thought through. Other issues were, how do we get access to the right data? So for example, if we think of somebody who's working remotely, if we needed to investigate somebody's physical laptop, or we needed to disconnect it from all servers immediately because of an imminent threat, there were questions that were raised. How do we do that remotely? How do we actually get a laptop, maybe our staff members working in Germany from their family's home, and how do we actually get it to our incident response provider? These are things that weren't necessarily thought through at the time. Mostly recovery suffered the most, and a lot of organizations had major impact in actually recovering from incidents. The SOPHIS recently released a report titled The State of Ransomware in Financial Services, and they actually released quite a extensive report in covering a lot of industries, so I encourage you to check it out. But from the financial services one, we can see that 34% of financial services organizations were actually hit by ransomware in the last year. And from this report, interestingly, it says that the average bill for rectifying ransomware, so for actually recovering from it, considering the downtime, people time, ransomware paid, importantly, was an average of about $2.10 million US, which is quite a lot of money for 34% of organizations. So now let's have a look at a case study. And this was an investigation that actually happened while in national lockdown, an investigation that I led myself. And it started with, there's a problem with the engineering network, manufacturing down, the manufacturing line is down, and please can we get IT to troubleshoot the problem. IT has a look, they find a strange process running on some of the servers, and this process is running at 100% CPU, and this is what is essentially causing this downtime in the manufacturing line. So IT takes a closer look, and they see a process that looks dodgy. They kill the process. As soon as they do that, it simply respawns. They then take a closer look. They see that there were some AV alerts on these servers that were issued just the day before. Unfortunately, they weren't monitored at the time, but it was an AV alert for a password stealer. The AV cleaned up the threat, and nobody noticed at the time. And while they were troubleshooting this issue, the ransomware message starts to appear first on the servers and then on the workstations. So at this point, IT scrambles to protect the backups, but it's too late. Backup servers already encrypted. Everything's down. Corporate network's down. Engineering network. And at this point, they contact law enforcement, who tells them they need to engage an incident response company to investigate what happened. Now, at the time, the UK was in full lockdown, and this organization had limited operations happening from their offices. And suddenly, everybody needed to come to the office, and they had to manually remove ransomware from their laptops and malware and that sort of thing. And domains had to be rebuilt, servers had to be rebuilt. So you can imagine that there was quite a bit of chaos. And in this chaos, with a very small security team, incident response, and the mission to find out what happened so you can stop it from happening again, that whole process takes a back seat. So they phoned us for help, and we went on site to help them out to alleviate some of the pressure that they were feeling in their team. We went to go collect evidence so we could actually start the investigation. We did some disk image collection from their physical servers in their data center, and we helped them request logs from external service providers so we could paint a picture of what actually happened. Eventually, we were able to get enough data to determine the root cause, and this was a network misconfiguration that exposed a vulnerable server to the internet, and the vulnerable server provided a foothold for the attacker, who enumerated the network, laterally moved to the domain controllers before deploying ransomware. As I mentioned before, this is the human-operated ransomware attack, and this is what we saw in this incident. In the aftermath, the backups were gone, at least for 4 months. They managed to recover 4-month-old backups, but you can imagine for a large manufacturing organization, 4 months worth of data is quite a lot of data. Domains had to be rebuilt from scratch, followed by the production servers. And staff couldn't actually work until their devices were cleaned and rejoined to the domain, which was quite a long process. All in all, it took around 3 months to restore operations. Now, everything I've said today certainly also applies to the state of incident response before the pandemic. And what we have to do is adapt our incident response plan and processes, because we've all had to make changes and we've all had to figure out new ways of working. And many of these ways of working have been more effective, and they aren't going anywhere. So we do need to adapt. Let's make sure that our incident response plans are not left behind. And it gives us an opportunity to be more prepared, because as humans, we simply aren't very good at preparing for disasters. First thing that we can do, define and testing our processes. So think about the incidents that could occur and what would be required for a successful incident response engagement within each of those categories of incidents. So for every eventuality, we need to define a process and we need to test that process. So let's start simple. If we think of a remote worker's host has been compromised, how can we capture data from it? How can we remotely acquire an image from it? How can we collect triage data from it? All of these are processes that we can simply define. If multiple remote devices are compromised, how will we isolate these devices from the main network remotely? And if our core communication system goes down, how will we actually communicate with our employees? In terms of business continuity and disaster recovery, if everything goes up in metaphorical flames, who does what and how? Let's define these processes and test them. We need to focus on the people. So educating our staff primarily, educating them about what a security incident is. We need to research the threat trends and make sure staff know what to look out for under a given set of circumstances. So for example, with the COVID-19 phishing trends, and we need to help them figure out what the processes are in order to actually report an incident. We need to make sure that they feel safe to do so. So we need to enhance the culture of staff making sure that they can report an incident rather than feeling shame if they've actually clicked on a phishing email, for example. We need to provide context-relevant guidance for our staff while working remotely around staying secure. And when I say context relevant, I mean different guidance might be required for different kinds of staff. So depending on the context of the user, so for example, an IT service desk employee's job is going to look very different from an infrastructure administrator or a marketing employee. So the guidance certainly needs to be context relevant. Then weaponizing our technology. So we need to let our technology increase our visibility and our reach on our environment. So rapid detection, remote response before it is too late to minimize the impact. We need to ensure that we're logging the right things in the right places so that we can answer the key questions in the event of an incident. And if you've transitioned to the cloud, there's a lot that can work in your favor, but these are not things that are necessarily enabled by default. It takes a lot of planning and foresight to make cloud technology work for you in a way that actually benefits detection and incident response. As for ransomware preparation specifically, Microsoft has actually recently released a very good guide for helping organizations plan for the threat of human-operated ransomware, and I recommend checking it out. Here are some examples of the project plans that you can make use of to prepare. So these are things that can be put into a larger strategic project plan. So for example, this is the secure backup plan, and here is the ransomware data protection plan. And there's quite a few categories of these, and they're very easy to follow and very measurable, which I really like. So I encourage you to check them out. I'll leave you with some homework. So let's think about these things in the context of your own environment. Do you have multi-factor authentication enabled? And in all places, not just in one. So if we're thinking of all of your VPN authentications, your AWS portals, your Azure portals, do you have firewall logs dating back at least 60 days? And could we get access to those as an incident response team? If you had an insider threat, could you stop them using the technology you already have? Could ransomware affect your backup servers, or are there plans to stop that sort of thing? How will you communicate with your team in a priority one incident? Could an IR team remotely gather evidence from 100 hosts in your environment? Or is there something else that you can consider putting in place before such an eventuality? Could your infrastructure team remotely remediate a serious threat on your crown jewel servers? Or are there processes that you need to think about in order to make that happen? And that's it from me. Thanks everybody for listening. If you have any questions, please do contact me via LinkedIn, or we will provide an email address for you to contact me on. Thank you.